All right, let's jump right into this explainer. I want you to imagine for just a second that you are stranded in the freezing woods. It is pouring rain, something in the brush is making a deeply unsettling sound, and your only tools are a literal rock and maybe a fading memory of a late-night survival video you watched 3 years ago. You're in trouble. Honestly, we all would be. But as we go through this deck today, we're going to see just how quickly you'd realize that our ancestors were actually far more advanced than us when it came to just staying alive. Seriously, I want you to ask yourself if you could truly survive out there. Because, it's so easy to look back and think of ancient humans as primitive or simple. Yet our ancestors absolutely thrived in these brutal, unforgiving conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. And they did it without a single piece of modern technology. No GPS, no synthetic fabrics, no nothing. And this really highlights the ultimate myth of our modern fragility. Think about the modern human today. We often completely fall apart during a mild 2-hour power outage, right? We need our Gore-Tex and our Wi-Fi just to function. But then look at the ancient human, displaying this astonishing zero-tech resilience, eating dirt to survive, using animal fat as a wetsuit. They were running a masterclass in survival every single day. Let's see exactly how they pulled it off. Okay, moving into section 1, bizarre dietary survival hacks and counterintuitive nutrition. Let's look at some techniques that sound absolutely insane today. Okay, so take geophagy. What is that? It is literally the practice of eating dirt. Now, anthropologists found that indigenous tribes weren't just eating clay by accident, they were using it as a highly effective natural detox system. Out in the wild, many plants and roots are packed with toxic compounds that will absolutely wreck your gut. But the Andes people in Peru, they would dip wild toxic potatoes in a clay sauce before eating them. The clay actually binds to the toxins in your digestive system and just flushes them out safely. This was also instinctively used by pregnant women all throughout history who were seeking crucial, life-saving minerals like calcium and iron. Now think about the circular economy of animal fat. Ancient humans, especially the Inuit up in the freezing Arctic, they wasted absolutely nothing. I mean, picture being in minus 30-degree weather with no high-tech winter gear. What did they do? They rubbed rendered seal and bear fat all over their skin as this DIY wetsuit technology to drastically reduce heat loss. But they didn't even stop there. They used that exact same fat as lamp fuel for hours of light, rubbed it on their skins for waterproofing, and even mixed it with red ochre to create a natural sunscreen against the blinding glare of the snow. Then we have the brilliant, though let's be honest, deeply unpleasant, science of controlled rotting. Almost every single ancient culture independently figured out that letting food rot in a very specific way preserved it for those harsh winters. The Vikings, for example, would bury toxic Greenland shark underground for months to break down the ammonia, creating an edible, albeit terrible-smelling, food called hockarl. Meanwhile, Romans and Asian cultures liquefied heavily salted fish over several months to create garum and fish sauces. These were liquids just absolutely loaded with protein, B vitamins, and umami that kept them nourished when all the fresh food dried up. So what happens when you combine those proteins and fats? Well, first, you take powdered meat, then you mix in rendered fat, and finally add some dried berries. That gets you pemmican. Developed by North American indigenous peoples, this was a 50-50 mix of protein and fat that you press into little cakes, and it literally lasts for years. It was so calorically dense and so perfectly preserved that centuries later, modern explorers, guys like Ernest Shackleton and Robert Peary, absolutely relied on this exact ancient recipe to survive their own expeditions to the extreme poles. All right, section 2, extreme ancient first aid, gross but genius medicine. Before modern antibiotics, an infected scratch was often a death sentence. Okay, hear me out on this one because I promise the science is fascinating, even if it sounds incredibly gross. We need to talk about the truth behind urine therapy. Fresh, sterile urine is incredibly rich in urea, which happens to be a natural antiseptic. Roman soldiers literally poured it right onto battlefield wounds to inhibit bacterial growth and prevent gangrene. Vikings used that same urea to break down proteins so they could tan leather and bleach textiles. There are even incredible accounts of shipwreck survivors soaking cloths in fresh urine to act as a crude air filter against toxic smoke. It was basically a multi-tool that you literally always had with you. And this just perfectly illustrates how ancient humans were practically running empirical science millennia ahead of actual medical theory. The ancient Egyptians applied moldy bread to wounds, accidentally inventing a penicillin treatment 3,000 years before Alexander Fleming just because the bread contained penicillium species. The ancient Greeks, they packed wounds with spider webs, which are naturally rich in vitamin K, promoting blood clotting.
And all across the ancient world, raw, unpasteurized honey was slathered on gashes because its low water content and natural hydrogen peroxide created the perfect bacteria-free healing environment.
Moving right along to Section 3, Masterclasses in Applied Physics and Biological Feats. These techniques were rigorous applied science.
Arguably, the most metal thing a human being can do is something called persistence hunting. The Kungan people of the Kalahari totally leveraged our unique evolutionary biology here. You see, most four-legged animals thermoregulate by panting, but the catch is they cannot pant while galloping. Humans, on the other hand, we sweat. We can thermoregulate while running continuously. So an ancient hunter would just relentlessly jog after a much faster antelope for hours on end. Eventually, the animal's body temperature just hits a critical level, it overheats, and it simply collapses. We quite literally ran our prey to death with sheer stubbornness.
And hey, if you thought that was wild, check out this next hack. It sounds like a total movie trick, but Arctic indigenous peoples intuitively understood complex optics. They'd find a piece of perfectly clear ice and, using just the warmth of their bare hands, they would shape it into a convex lens. Then, by angling this ice lens at the midday sun, they could concentrate the solar energy enough to ignite dried moss or fungus. Think about that for a second. They used the very thing trying to freeze them to death to create fire. That is pure applied physics developed entirely through generational experimentation. Let's zoom out a bit for Section 4, Engineering the Natural World and Environmental Control. This is where they mastered their macro environment. Now, what's incredibly impressive is how they scaled this up. Polynesian wayfinders navigated across 64 million square miles of the open Pacific Ocean without a single compass, map, or instrument. They encoded an immensely complex navigation system entirely into human memory. A master navigator would lie on the hull of the canoe just to feel the directional ocean swells. They'd track 32 different rising and setting star paths, observe how clouds bunched up over unseen islands, and even read the glowing phosphorescence in the water. It was a flawless data system trained entirely into the human mind and body. And back on land, they were just as deeply connected to the environment. Indigenous peoples across Australia, North America, and Southern Africa intuitively used controlled burns to manage the entire landscape. By deliberately setting these low-level fires, they cleared out the dry underbrush. And you know what that did? It prevented the catastrophic, uncontrollable megafires that we are seeing today. Plus, the ash returned vital minerals back to the soil, prompting fresh green shoots that attracted grazing animals for much more predictable hunting. It's a 50,000-year-old practice that modern authorities, after centuries of disastrous suppression and massive wildfires, are really only just now humbling themselves to reintegrate. Okay, this brings us to our final category, Section 5, the ultimate survival secret, beyond the lone wolf. So what really kept people alive? The secret lies in a concept anthropologists call reciprocal altruism. This completely dismantles that cinematic Hollywood myth of the tough lone wolf survivalist fighting the wilderness all by themselves. What kept groups alive generation after generation was complex social engineering. In hunter-gatherer bands, sharing the meat from a successful hunt wasn't charity. It was evolutionary self-interest. It was a strict insurance policy. You share today so that when your own family inevitably has a bad hunt next week, the social safety net catches you. And a massive part of that social safety net was the elders. By aggregating all this survival knowledge, groups thrived. In modern times, aging populations are sometimes dismissed, right? But in the ancient world, elders were fiercely protected. They served as irreplaceable living libraries. They were the ones who remembered the subtle details of a drought from 40 years prior, or exactly which seasonal plants were toxic. By distributing this massive cognitive and physical load across a whole group and relying on the memory of those elders, ancient groups easily outlasted any isolated lone wolf expert. Which really brings us to a highly uncomfortable realization. We didn't actually get smarter than our ancestors. We just developed different tools. They were brilliant scientists, doctors, engineers working strictly with raw nature. So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. If our modern tools, our Wi-Fi, our complex supply chains, and our power grids, if all of that just disappeared tomorrow, who among us would actually know what to do?